Every day is a new day, but only for those who aim to change with the new horizons. For Richard Ben, that day began like any other, routine and predictable. He woke up, put on his uniform, strapped on his gadgets, checked his wireless, and glanced at the mirror by the door. It reflected back the image of a seasoned cop, confident and assured, a man who knew the streets and believed he had them all figured out. But what Ben didn't see in that reflection was the heap of shame and regret waiting to crash down on him. Richard Ben had seen it all in his 15 years on the force, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But what stuck with him most were the moments that confirmed his worldview, one shaped by his upbringing in a small working-class town. His father, a proud but bitter man, had lost his job when Ben was just a boy, and the resentment had seeped into the family like poison. In their home, the enemy was always them, the ones who didn't belong, who didn't look like the Bens, and who supposedly sucked the life out of the country with their demands for handouts. Ben's father had drilled these beliefs into him, and over the years, they hardened into something more than just prejudice. They became a lens through which he viewed the world. Ben was tall and imposing, his square jaw perpetually clenched as if ready to bite down on something or someone. His cold blue eyes scanned the streets with a sense of ownership, as though every inch of this city was his to patrol, to control. He liked the feeling of authority that came with the badge, the way people stiffened when he approached, the way his voice could make them second-guess their every move. To Ben, the world was black and white, just like the car he drove. Today, as he sat in his patrol car on a quiet residential street, Ben's mind wandered back to the previous night. He had been out drinking with a few fellow officers, letting off steam after a long week. The conversation had turned, as it often did, to the state of the city, the rising crime rates, the constant strain on resources. And as usual, it wasn't long before the topic shifted to the problem neighborhoods, the places where the troublemakers lived. Ben had nodded along, adding his own gripes to the mix. But even as the conversation veered into darker territory, as some of his colleagues made jokes that skirted the line of decency, Ben felt a sense of validation. He wasn't alone in his thoughts, and that gave him a twisted sense of comfort. They were all just venting, as one of his friends put it. But for Ben, it was more than that. It was a confirmation of everything he believed. Jonathan Pierce had always believed in the power of change. As an entrepreneur and social worker, he had dedicated his life to improving the lives of others, especially those who, like him, had faced challenges simply because of the color of their skin. Jonathan had built a successful business from the ground up, a tech company that not only thrived but also gave back to the community. He used his success to fund programs for underprivileged youth, offering them opportunities that had been scarce for him growing up. But despite his accomplishments, Jonathan was no stranger to the prejudice that still existed in the world. He had been pulled over more times than he could count, had been followed around in stores, and had seen the way people sometimes looked at him. With suspicion, with fear, with disdain. It was a part of his life that he had learned to navigate with grace, though it never got any easier. Today, Jonathan was on his way to a meeting with a potential investor, someone who could help take his company's philanthropic efforts to the next level. He was dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his demeanor calm and composed as he drove through the city. But as he approached a stop sign, something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A police car parked just up the street, its officer watching him intently. Jonathan felt a familiar knot form in his stomach, a tension that came with every interaction with law enforcement. He took a deep breath and continued driving, hoping to avoid any confrontation. But as he passed the patrol car, he saw the officer pull out behind him, the flashing lights immediately following. Ben had seen Jonathan's car, a sleek, black sedan, cruise by, and something about it had set off alarm bells in his mind. Maybe it was the way the driver carried himself, too confident, too self-assured for someone in this neighborhood. Or maybe it was just the fact that Ben was bored, itching for something to break the monotony of his day. Whatever the reason, he decided to follow the car, his pulse quickening with anticipation. As Ben pulled Jonathan over, he could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline. He stepped out of his squad car, adjusting his belt as he approached the driver's side window. The driver, a black man in his mid-30s, was already rolling down his window, his hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. "License and registration," Ben barked, his voice sharp. Jonathan handed over his documents without a word, his expression neutral. Ben scanned them quickly, noting the clean record and the expensive address listed. It didn't fit with the narrative Ben had constructed in his mind, and that irked him. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Ben asked, his tone carrying a hint of accusation. Jonathan looked at him, his eyes steady. "I'm on my way to a meeting." Ben narrowed his eyes, his suspicion deepening. "A meeting, huh? In a suit like that, driving a car like this, you must be doing pretty well for yourself." Jonathan could sense where this was going, and he chose his words carefully. "I run a business. We work with community programs around the city." Ben's jaw tightened. "Is that right? And what kind of business would that be?" "A tech company," Jonathan replied, keeping his tone even. "We focus on software development and education programs for underprivileged youth." Ben scoffed, the bitterness he had been carrying around for years bubbling to the surface. "Funny, you don't look like a tech guy." Jonathan's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but he forced himself to stay calm. "And what does a tech guy look like?" Ben leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, threatening tone. "Not like someone who's up to no good." The tension between the two men was palpable. Ben's words hung in the air, thick with the unspoken prejudices that had driven him to make this stop in the first place. Jonathan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the familiar mix of anger and frustration rising within him. But he had learned long ago that reacting in anger would only make things worse. "Officer," Jonathan said carefully, "I'm not sure what you're implying, but I assure you, I'm not up to anything. I'm just trying to get to my meeting." Ben wasn't satisfied. There was something about Jonathan that rubbed him the wrong way. The confidence, the calmness, the refusal to be intimidated. It challenged everything Ben believed about people like him, and that made him angry. "Step out of the car," Ben ordered. Jonathan hesitated. He knew his rights, knew that he hadn't done anything wrong. But he also knew that refusing could escalate the situation, and he wasn't willing to take that risk. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, his hands visible at all times. Ben watched him closely, looking for any excuse to assert his authority. He gestured for Jonathan to move to the back of the car, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Jonathan complied, his heart pounding in his chest as he moved. As Ben began to question him further, it became clear that this wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. The questions were probing, invasive, designed to trip Jonathan up or reveal something that Ben could use against him. But Jonathan remained calm, answering each question with measured precision, refusing to give Ben the satisfaction of seeing him flustered. The minutes dragged on, and Jonathan's frustration grew. He had worked hard to get where he was, had overcome countless obstacles to build a successful life, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of his skin. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and it took every ounce of self-control he had to keep his emotions in check. Finally, Ben seemed to run out of steam. There was nothing in Jonathan's answers that he could use, no slip-up that would justify the stop. But Ben wasn't ready to back down just yet. He needed to find something, anything, to validate his actions. "Pop the trunk," Ben ordered. Jonathan hesitated again. "Why?" "I said, pop the trunk," Ben repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. With a resigned sigh, Jonathan walked back to the driver's seat and pressed the button to release the trunk. Ben walked around to the back of the car, his hands still on his gun as he prepared to search the vehicle. But as he looked inside the trunk, his heart skipped a beat. There, among the neatly organized contents, was a folder with the logo of Jonathan's company emblazoned on it. The title on the front read, "Youth Empowerment Initiative, Strategic Plan 2024. Ben felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he began to piece together the truth. This wasn't just some random driver he had pulled over. This was Jonathan Pierce, the Jonathan Pierce, one of the city's most respected entrepreneurs and philanthropists. The man whose face had been plastered on billboards promoting his company's work with underprivileged youth, the man who had been featured in countless articles for his contributions to the community. Ben's mind raced as he realized the gravity of his mistake. He had targeted Jonathan simply because of his own biases, and now he was in way over his head. Jonathan watched Ben's expression change as he opened the trunk and saw the contents. He could see the realization dawning on the officer's face, the shift from arrogance to fear. For a moment, Jonathan felt a surge of satisfaction. Ben was finally understanding who he had messed with. But that satisfaction was quickly replaced by a deeper sense of weariness. This was just another reminder that no matter how much he achieved, no matter how successful he became, he would always be seen as a threat first and a person second. Ben's voice wavered as he spoke again, his previous bravado gone. "Mr. Pierce, I didn't realize who you were." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "Does it matter who I am?" Ben faltered, his mind scrambling for an excuse, a way out. "I just thought, there's been some suspicious activity in this area, And you thought I was part of it," Jonathan finished for him, his tone laced with anger. "Because I'm a black man driving a nice car in a nice neighborhood." Ben opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He had no defense, no justification that wouldn't sound hollow and insincere. Jonathan took a step closer, his eyes locking onto Ben's. "Do you have any idea how often this happens? How often people like me get pulled over, harassed, and treated like criminals for no reason other than the color of our skin?" Ben swallowed hard, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had crossed a line, and there was no way to undo the damage. "I'm sorry," Ben finally managed to say, the words sounding weak even to his own ears. Jonathan shook his head, the anger still simmering beneath the surface. "Sorry doesn't cut it, Officer Ben. You could have ruined my life today. What if I wasn't who you thought I was? What if I had reacted differently? You would have had no problem escalating this situation, and for what? To satisfy your own biases." Ben couldn't meet Jonathan's gaze. The truth of his words cut deep, exposing the ugliness that Ben had tried to justify for so long. He had always seen himself as just doing his job, but now, faced with the reality of his actions, he realized how much harm he had caused. The encounter left Ben shaken. He had been so certain, so sure of his instincts, and yet he had been completely wrong. As he walked back to his squad car, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: shame, anger, fear. He knew that this wouldn't end here. Jonathan Pierce was a powerful man, with connections and influence. This incident would come back to haunt him, and he had no one to blame but himself. Jonathan watched Ben retreat, his hands still trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. He had stood his ground, had called Ben out on his racism, but the victory felt hollow. This wasn't just about one cop, one bad encounter. This was about a system that was stacked against him and others like him. It was exhausting, fighting this battle over and over again, never knowing when the next encounter would be. But Jonathan also knew that he couldn't let this go. He couldn't let Ben walk away without facing the consequences of his actions. He took out his phone and recorded the license plate of the patrol car, making a mental note of the time and location. He would file a complaint, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been in his shoes and hadn't had the means to fight back. The complaint was filed the next day, and it didn't take long for the news to spread. Jonathan Pierce was a well-known figure in the city, and his story quickly gained traction in the media. Reports of the incident were everywhere, detailing how a respected entrepreneur and philanthropist had been targeted by a racist cop during a routine traffic stop. The public outcry was immediate and intense, with calls for Ben's suspension and an investigation into the department's practices. Ben watched the fallout unfold from the sidelines, his stomach in knots as the headlines piled up. His fellow officers avoided him, the once friendly camaraderie replaced by uncomfortable silence. Ben knew what they were thinking, that he had crossed a line, that he had brought shame on the department. And deep down, he knew they were right. The investigation was swift and thorough. Ben was questioned repeatedly, his actions scrutinized by internal affairs. Every detail of the encounter was picked apart, every word he had said analyzed for evidence of misconduct. The more they dug, the worse it looked for Ben. His past complaints, those he had brushed off as misunderstandings, were now coming back to haunt him, painting a damning picture of a man who had let his prejudices dictate his actions. Jonathan, too, was questioned, though his role in the investigation was less about finding fault and more about understanding the broader implications of what had happened. He spoke calmly and clearly, laying out the facts without embellishment. But he didn't hold back when it came to describing the impact of Ben's actions, the fear, the humiliation, the sense of injustice that lingered long after the incident had ended. As the investigation drew to a close, Ben was called into a meeting with the chief of police. The chief was a stern man, his face lined with years of experience and the weight of responsibility. He didn't mince words as he laid out the consequences of Ben's actions. "You've brought shame to this department, Ben," the chief said, his voice cold. "We've worked hard to build trust in this community, and you've undermined all of that with your behavior." Ben remained silent, his head bowed as the chief continued. "You're being suspended without pay, effective immediately. You'll also be required to undergo mandatory training on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. And let me be clear, if anything like this happens again, you will be terminated. Do you understand?" Ben nodded, the weight of the chief's words pressing down on him like a physical burden. He had known this was coming, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. His career was hanging by a thread, and he had no one to blame but himself. The suspension was a wake-up call for Ben. For the first time in his career, he was forced to confront the reality of his actions, to acknowledge the harm he had caused. The training sessions were intense, pushing him to examine his biases, to question the beliefs that had shaped him for so long. It was a painful process, one that stripped away the layers of self-righteousness and arrogance he had built up over the years. But as difficult as it was, Ben began to see things in a new light. He started to understand the impact of his actions, not just on Jonathan Pierce, but on every person he had treated unfairly. He realized that his behavior wasn't just a reflection of his own flaws, but a symptom of a broader problem, a culture of prejudice and discrimination that permeated not just the police force, but society as a whole. Jonathan, meanwhile, continued his work, using the platform he had gained from the incident to advocate for change. He spoke out about the need for police reform, for greater accountability and transparency. He pushed for new policies that would protect people from the kind of harassment he had experienced, and he worked to ensure that Ben's actions wouldn't be repeated. The incident had taken a toll on Jonathan, but it had also strengthened his resolve. He was determined to make a difference, to use his voice and his influence to fight for justice. And while the encounter with Ben had been a painful reminder of the challenges he still faced, it had also reinforced his belief in the power of change. As time passed, the consequences of Ben's actions continued to haunt him, casting a long shadow over his life and career. The suspension and mandatory training had been just the beginning. The real punishment was the ongoing isolation and shame that followed him everywhere he went. Back on the force, Ben found that things had changed irreversibly. His fellow officers, once his friends and allies, now kept their distance. The camaraderie that had once defined their relationships was gone, replaced by awkward silences and sidelong glances. No one said it outright, but Ben could feel the judgment in their eyes, the silent condemnation for having brought disgrace upon the department. He was no longer the confident, respected cop he had once been. Instead, he was the cautionary tale, the example of what not to do. Ben tried to carry on with his work, but it was impossible to ignore the whispers that followed him, the way conversations would abruptly stop when he entered a room. Even the newer recruits, who hadn't known him before the incident, seemed to regard him with suspicion. They had heard the stories, seen the headlines, and they kept their distance, wary of being associated with a man who had become a pariah. The weight of his actions bore down on Ben every day, eroding the self-assured persona he had once cultivated. He found himself questioning every decision, second-guessing his instincts. The pride he had once taken in his work was gone, replaced by a deep sense of inadequacy and doubt. He had lost the trust of his peers, and worse, he had lost his own sense of purpose. Outside of work, things were no better. The community he had once policed with a heavy hand now regarded him with disdain. Ben couldn't walk through the neighborhood without feeling the stares, the cold indifference of those who knew who he was and what he had done. He was no longer just a cop. He was the racist cop, the one who had been called out and exposed. The shame of it clung to him like a second skin, inescapable and suffocating. Ben's personal life also began to unravel. The friends he had once relied on for support drifted away, uncomfortable with the stigma that now surrounded him. He found himself increasingly isolated, spending long nights alone, replaying the events that had led to his downfall. The sense of isolation grew stronger with each passing day, eating away at his confidence and his sense of self-worth. The mandatory training sessions that Ben had been required to attend had done little to ease his conscience. While they had forced him to confront his biases, they had also stripped away the last remnants of his former identity. He could no longer take refuge in the belief that he was just doing his job. He now understood the full extent of the harm he had caused, and it was a realization that left him hollow and broken. As Ben struggled with his internal demons, Jonathan Pierce continued to thrive. The incident had propelled Jonathan into the spotlight, and he used the platform to effect real change. He became a prominent voice in the fight for racial justice, his influence growing as he worked tirelessly to ensure that what had happened to him would not happen to others. Jonathan's success only served to deepen Ben's sense of failure and inadequacy. Every time Ben saw Jonathan's name in the news or heard about the positive changes he was spearheading, it was like a knife twisting in his gut. Ben couldn't escape the comparison between the two of them. Jonathan, who had risen above the encounter with dignity and strength, and Ben, who had been left to wallow in the wreckage of his own making. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, but the shame never lessened. It became a constant companion, a reminder of the man Ben had been and the mistakes he had made. He tried to rebuild his life, to find some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. The stain of his actions was too deep, too indelible. In the end, Ben was left with nothing but his regrets. The career that had once defined him was now a source of pain and humiliation. The badge he had once worn with pride now felt like a burden, a symbol of all he had lost. The isolation, the guilt, and the shame were his only companions, and they followed him wherever he went, a reminder that some mistakes could never be undone. Ben's life became a slow, painful descent into obscurity. He continued to work, but without the respect of his peers or the community, it was a hollow existence. He was a ghost in his own life, haunted by the man he had once been and the man he could never be again. The consequences of his actions were inescapable, and they would follow him for the rest of his days, a permanent reminder of the price of prejudice and the cost of unchecked power.